Hello and welcome to Season 10, Episode 8 of the Data Governance Podcast. And this week we are going to look at the interesting topic of data risks, because I think this is a topic that we don't think about and definitely do not talk about enough, but yet it is an incredibly important part of data governance. And I'm really thrilled that I'm joined this week by a long-term data friend, Navin Ahuja, who, because of his particular career path in and around data governance, I think makes him the best person in my network to talk about data risks. So it's great to have him on the podcast to discuss all things data risk. So, hello and welcome to another episode of the Data Governance Podcast. And in today's episode, I'm really thrilled to have Navin Ahuja on the call. Now, I have known you, Navin, for we reckon about 12 years now, back when we were working in insurance together. So Navin these days is an independent data governance consultant, but he was a data governance manager for a number of insurance companies before doing a role as an auditor, which was going over to the dark side, and then coming back to data governance. And, you know, more recently, you've been an independent data governance consultant, and I think that's great. Obviously, I'm biased. I am one myself. But I noticed recently that you've been posting some really interesting posts on LinkedIn about data risks. And I think this is an area of data governance that not enough people, including myself, talk about enough. And I think it's a really important thing. So I just thought it was really obvious to get you on the podcast. So welcome to the podcast, Navin.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I appreciate that.
So obviously, from that intro, it's quite clear I wanted to ask you about data risks, but I wanted to ask you what I ask nearly everybody that I have on the podcast, which is, so how long have you been doing data governance? And more interestingly, how did you get into it? Because it's still viewed as somewhat of an unusual career choice by a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So like most people, I fell into it. It wasn't planned. I got into it in 2010. I got into it. And that was after having spent many years as an analyst and a developer. And then I was asked to look at data governance in the context of Solvency II. I had very little knowledge of data governance and even less of Solvency II. So quite a big challenge, as you can appreciate.
I'm sure. But it obviously worked out. You found something that you enjoyed. Clearly, you're still doing it all these years later.
Indeed, yeah. It just takes a little while understanding why am I doing this? And I think there's a big difference between doing things mechanically. I have to have data owners, I have to have data stewards, box ticked, and understanding why. And I think that why is absolutely crucial, and the same applies to data risk.
Well, that's a really good a reminder that that's what we're actually here to talk about. So I think, you and I are probably very comfortable with the term, but perhaps some of the people listening to the podcast will perhaps not be so familiar. So when you talk about a data risk, what do you actually mean by that?
Okay, so most people will think data privacy risk, and that's valid, or data security risk, and that's valid. I'm talking, like you, Nicola, I don't view data governance as data privacy or data security. I think it facilitates those disciplines, but it's not the same thing. Okay, so when I talk about data risk, I'm talking about data quality risk. Now, a lot of people think then, well, he's just talking about quality for quality's sake, and that's not what I'm talking about. I don't think we should measure the quality of data purely because, I don't know, a certain field is only 90% completed, not 100%. If there's no impact, it doesn't matter. But if there is an impact, if there's an impact on the reporting or on the processes that use that data, then you potentially have a risk. Okay, so think about the, I think, so-called fat finger error by one city trader back in, I think, 2022 that resulted in, I think it was a £60 million fine to the institution, instability in markets for several days, and a loss of or reputational damage to the institution. If
Mm.
that's not data quality risk, I don't know what is. And yet, often when you talk about data quality risk, you're right, people don't really see data risk in that way. But I think it is a risk.
Oh, absolutely. And I always think that obviously we both met when we were both working in insurance, and Solvency II was doing a lot of focus on data governance, and it did ask you to look at the risks to your data. And I remember having a chat to an actuary at the time, and one of the top risks for an insurer, as I'm sure you know, is of inaccurate reserving. And for anybody listening, reserving is what an insurance company does to make sure they put aside enough money to pay their claims. And if they do their forecasting and their calculations wrong, then they might not have enough money, and that will be the end of the firm. And it was quite funny because before we started talking data risks with them, the risk would in the risk register would just read there is a risk of inaccurate reserving. And it's only when you start talking to them and pointing out that one of the really big things that could make that happen is you get poor quality data or the wrong data, or some of the data's missing. And that was what really, I think, brought it to light when I was first using the terminology for Solvency II.
Yes. Yes, very much so.
And I have you ever worked closely with like operational risk people? Because I find it's that same kind of thinking. It's almost like a specialist kind of operational risk is a
Mm.
data risk.
Yes, I have actually. And you're right, the thinking is very similar.
Yeah, I've often tried to poach operational risk people and train them up to be data governance because I think they have the right mindset. They think like us. So, you
Indeed.
obviously are, very enthusiastic, and I totally agree with you, the value that looking at and managing your data risk can bring. So,
Mm.
what actually led to you developing a data risk and control methodology, though?
So, Solvency two, as you say, and actually reserving. So let's talk about that. I think it's actually a really good example. So for Solvency two, for as you know, is around the capital adequacy, right, of the firm. So reserving risk is one risk. Operational risk you mentioned is another. Liquidity risk, yeah. So shocks to financial markets. What does that mean for the carrier? And as you know, a lot of the data that hits the capital model is not data in the sense that you and I know. Okay, so it's not numbers are keyed into the front office system that then goes straight into the capital model and out comes a result. What actually happens is that number's keyed in, there's then augmentation of that data. So let's take your reserving example. Okay, the actuaries come along, they say, okay, we need to now get to the reserving best estimate. Okay, so they use data to get to that best estimate, but that best estimate then becomes data.
Yes.
Right? It is a number, the IBNR number. Okay, incurred but not reported.
Hmm.
That IBNR number is then taken, so that becomes data in its own right, even though it's a judgment, and is then used to create COVs. Right, so this is the degree of volatility within that number. Okay, to what extent do we expect that number to hold true? That's the simplistic way it was explained to me. I'm no statistician. That's data as well, arguably, although it's a result of actuarial expert judgment.
Mm.
Now, I was new to data governance, and I was told, oh, well, to measure data, just look at your data quality dimensions, your accuracy, your completeness, conformity, etc. And as you know, for Solvency two, data had to be accurate, complete, and appropriate.
Yep.
Right. So there's a requirement that each line of business had a COV or reserving parameter against it. Well, it was always going to have, it was always going to be 100% because the model wouldn't accept any lines of business without a COV. So you could put that into a dashboard, it'd be 100%, and what's it going to prove? Well, it won't prove anything.
So,
Reality, it won't. The risk here is around, well, how did you get to your reserving best estimate? What data did you use? What techniques did you apply? And then how did you get to your COVs? Okay, I don't want this to get too technical, and I'm conscious
Okay.
I'm lapsing into insurance and actuarial terminology. You can appreciate that a simple set of data quality indicators, and this is what I'm saying, is not really going to achieve much. Right?
No.
So, okay, well, how do you do this then? How do you convince a regulator that your COVs, in this case, your parameters are accurate, complete, and appropriate? Well, you then need to look at, well, what were the controls applied? Okay, so we know to create this so-called data, you had to go through a judgment process. There must have been a control over that. Let's measure the control. Okay, so that makes sense. The flip side of control is risk. It's as simple as that. Okay, because the next question then becomes, well, how do you know you've got the right controls? Yeah, and this
Mm.
question I asked myself before the auditors asked me. I'm pleased to say. So it was, well, that's fine. But then what if you're challenged and someone says, well, okay, so it's reliant on the controls. It's not a simple, oh, well, my data's complete. Therefore, yeah, every line of business has got a parameter. How do you know you've got the right controls? So you then need to look at the risk. What are the controls designed to mitigate? They are designed to mitigate a specific risk. And if those controls are in the wrong place or are perhaps not comprehensive enough, then your controls aren't adequate. So that then led me to, so this was a light bulb moment for me. Okay. And
Mm.
well, hold on a minute. You need to look at your risks, yeah, your data risks, then determine have I got the right controls rather than just saying, well, we've got some controls, so that's probably good enough.
And
Well, it
I've spoken to a lot of people who've said exactly that. It's a,
and,
oh, we have a reconciliation. The data arrived, so that's a control. And you go,
yeah,
yeah, but was it the right data?
and that's exactly it. That's exactly it, Nicola. And I've actually worked in companies where they will say, well, we have got controls. And then you say, but how do you know you've got the right ones? And it's just, well, we do. And they may have the right ones, but they haven't been through a process of actually working that out.
Mm,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
So it led me to think about, well, okay, you need to start first at the risk, and then you need to think about the controls. Right. So you talk about the operational risk guys. So and you're right, they think in a very similar way to we do. And if you talk to risk professionals, they talk about inherent risk and residual risk. So inherent risk is really the risk before any controls are applied. Residual is, okay, what's the risk after the controls
Yeah.
are applied? Yeah, so it makes sense. And this gives you a framework to then start thinking about, well, how do I actually articulate what the risk is? And how do I then determine have I got the right controls in place? Because there'll always be risk. We face risk every time, well, every day, get out of bed.
Mm.
It's not about trying to eliminate risk, but about understanding the risk, choosing what you mitigate, and then what's within risk appetite. That's standard risk management. I've spoken to many heads of risk management. When I use that language, they're very happy. Okay. It's language that they understand, but we just don't seem to refer to that language, which is just common sense in reality when we think about data governance. Instead, what people do is they think about, oh, well, I've got some data quality indicators, I've got some metrics, and I've got some controls. So that's my framework. You need to go further.
Missing. Yeah, you're
And
missing it.
it's very reactive. And if you think about, that so-called fat finger error, there were controls in place. But what the regulator said was you didn't have all the controls you needed. So clearly, you need to go through this kind of process. And that's what the regulator is expecting.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, all the financial regulators do. So, how does your methodology actually work? I mean, you probably haven't got time to go into a deep dive, but can you give us an overview of how it works?
Yeah, sure. So I've already given away part of it. Look at the risk. How do you determine the risk? Okay. You need to have good lineage. So when I talk about lineage, Again, misconceptions. A lot of people think, oh, he's talking about the technical lineage, the system lineage. Kind of, yes. But you need to understand, how is this data created in the first place? Right? The technical lineage won't tell you that. Was it as a result of someone keying data into the system? Often that's where we start. Okay, well, how do we know that data was accurate? What was their golden source?
Yes.
How do we know that's actually a good golden source to use? Yeah. So all of these sort of questions start, once you start on this process, you start asking these questions, and they're important questions to ask.
Absolutely.
So lineage or the flow of data, and I mean by that principally around the actual business lineage, the processes, as well as the technical lineage, enables you to ask these questions and then to determine, well, where are my risks? So every time data is touched, if I'm keying data in, I have a risk, right? I might make a mistake. If data is moving from point A to point B, there is a risk. And you think, well, that's obvious. Surely there are recs. Actually, I've worked for a number of companies, and you say, you've got a reconciliation over this, and they'll say, oh, no. Right. So it's not that obvious. So every time data's touched, there's a risk. Once you can articulate that risk clearly, okay, saying, well, there's a data risk isn't good enough. There's a risk that data may be miskeyed. There's a risk that there may be corruption or loss of data as a result of migrating it from point A to point B. Okay. You need to be specific. Once you understand those risks, you can then start thinking about, have we got the right controls?
Against it.
And yeah, and again, when you think about the controls, you need to think, how are those controls worded? What's the narrative? Are they clear? Talk to any SOX auditor, and they will say you need very clear narratives around your controls so that the operator understands what they're supposed to do and how you evidence that. Okay, so this is all very much firmly within the realm of what a risk management person or an auditor would recognise. And certainly, you mentioned the posts I've done. I've had a lot of CROs, heads of risk, sort of acknowledge this and say, yeah, absolutely, this is language we understand. People need to be doing this. But as I say, we don't necessarily do it with data. I haven't seen it done to
Definitely
a
not.
meaningful
No.
degree elsewhere. And so, but that's the way the methodology works. So understand your flow, articulate your risks at each point, look at the controls. Are they adequate? And that's it.
Yeah, and that all sounds sensible when you say it like that, doesn't it?
Well, I was going to say 3 easy steps, but they're not.
Easy
Get
to
into
say,
that
harder to
lineage.
do.
Get into that lineage is probably the hardest bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you can't just rely on a technical lineage. And people, I was looking the other day at what a certain data quality tool called a business lineage. And it's nowhere near the level of detail that you need to carry out this analysis.
So that means obviously it's going to take a little while to complete data lineage. Do you think you should be doing this data risk and control on all data? Because that sounds like
No,
a lot of work.
it is a lot of work. And as with all things, and any risk management professional will tell you this, you need to be proportionate. I seem to recall Solvency II had a principle of proportionality. For Solvency II, yeah, you kind of do need to do this. Although actually, even then, that's an interesting one, Nicola, because for Solvency II, I did a full lineage, but I didn't necessarily go all the way back to when a risk is keyed into the system. Because by the time that risk has been summarized and an actuary has, again, put a judgment around it, it then ends up as a parameter in the model. You know what? If, let's just say, even, I don't know, 5%, 10%, I'm making this up now, of premiums or claims were the wrong figures, it probably wouldn't move the dial. Okay, so you need to be, so that's an example of proportionality in the context of Solvency II. But I think also when you're looking at other data flows, if the risk is not that great, and I'll leave it to you to determine, well, what does that mean? Well, actually, maybe you don't need to go to this level, or maybe you take it up a level. That's a policy decision, but you should at least be thinking about where you stand on how far you go with this and what data flows you apply it to. It
Yeah,
probably makes
absolutely.
sense to apply it to all.
Yeah, and I think Solvency II was the first time that I ever came across this principle of proportionality and
Mm,
materiality, because it was telling you to
mm,
put your most effort into the data that was the most material or critical.
right. Yeah.
Um, and I have introduced that concept to everybody I've ever spoken to ever since. And it
Mm,
works well, regardless of
mm,
what sector you work in. You really want
mm,
to be focusing all your efforts into the most important data. And if it's some tiny little piece of data that is only used by one obscure team in your organization, we don't want to do complicated data lineages and risk and control assessments.
no.
But if this is absolutely critical to support, the key business process in your organization, then it feels like something perhaps you should be doing.
Indeed, indeed. But it does take time, Nicola, and I recognise that. So, would this be something I'd be recommending we do straight off the bat? After all, it's that important? Probably not, because as you know, a lot of data governance is change management. Okay, you
Mm.
start off with complicated lineage. Well, you may not win those hearts and minds. Having said that, I have done it with clients where there's been a specific requirement, either regulatory or internal audit, have actually said, actually we want you
Yeah.
to be doing this. So I said, okay, fine. Well, let's make a start on that then. But so it does depend on, as you say, which data we're talking about, the processes within which that data is used, and also where they are in terms of their organisational maturity.
I think that's a really
It's
good
pretty
point.
well.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly my experience is
Hmm.
do it sooner if you've got a regulator or internal audit asking for it, but if not, maybe leave it a bit till you've
Yeah,
got some of the other things in place, and then you can determine
exactly.
what's useful to do. So
Yeah,
we are rapidly running out of time. So I thought I'd just ask you one quick question at the end is, so if
cool.
somebody's listening to this and going, oh my God, I've been doing data governance for a while and I haven't even thought about data risk controls, what would your best advice be for somebody in that situation be?
I think what I've just said. So think about which data you need to apply this to. And that ultimately will depend on, well, how's that data being used? You need to look at the use case. Okay.
Mm.
And also, do you need to go down to the nth degree straight away? Probably not. Make a start. I think lineage is something that is layered. Okay. You can start at a relatively high level, see where that gets you. Do we need to peel back another layer? Yeah, we do. Do that. Okay. Rather than going on this massive expedition of trying to work out at the most detailed level what your lineage is and not getting anything else done. So determine the use case. If you think, yeah, okay, we need to go down to this, we need to do something on this, fine. But you can start light and you can build it up.
Excellent. Well, that's great advice. And I hope that people will perhaps return and to listen to this podcast again when they get to that point in their journey, because I think you've shared some really great advice. So thank you so much for sharing your advice on the podcast, Navin. It's been great talking to you as always.
You're welcome, Nicola. Thank you. I hope it's been useful.
Certainly has. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Navin. He really has some great points to share, and I'm sure this is going to be one of that you want to go and re-listen to and press pause as you make notes, or maybe even use an AI transcription tool, but definitely one to be making notes on, because I think this is a really important but much overlooked aspect of data governance. So I hope you did enjoy that, and I hope you'll come back next week when we have a bite-sized episode when we're going to look at the important question of should all data be governed? And I will give you a slight hint. Perhaps my view on this has changed significantly over the years. So please join me next week to find out my views on that.